If you had entered the Oval Office on a gray, freezing afternoon during the winter of 1946, you would have discovered President Harry Truman gazing intensely at a massive map of the North Atlantic mounted on the wall. The Second World War had finally concluded. The ticker tape from victory celebrations in Times Square had been cleared away by sanitation workers. Soldiers were returning home. Yet Harry Truman was far from peaceful. He was preparing for an unprecedented kind of conflict, a silent struggle that would not involve tanks tearing through French countryside or Marines assaulting Pacific beaches. This war would be waged with long-range bombers in the upper atmosphere and nuclear submarines patrolling the crushing depths beneath the Arctic Ocean. As his finger traced across the map, his gaze repeatedly returned to one enormous white expanse dominating the globe's northern region: Greenland. To ordinary Americans in 1946, Greenland represented nothing more than a jagged ice block on weather forecasts. It was a realm of indigenous peoples, polar bears, and perpetual winter, an empty wilderness. However, to Harry Truman, his military strategists, and the recently established Joint Chiefs of Staff, it represented the most crucial piece of territory on Earth. They understood a terrifying geographical reality. Should the Soviet Union ever choose to strike the United States, their bombers would not cross the Atlantic or Pacific. They would fly directly over the North Pole. This route was the shortest path. It was the highway of annihilation. Greenland sat precisely in the middle of that highway. It served as North America's shield. Another reason fueled Truman's obsession with this frozen island. Hidden deep within Atlantic Alliance naval strategy was a choke point known to admirals as the GIUK gap. This acronym represented Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. It referred to narrow stretches of storm-tossed ocean between these three landmasses. This was the Soviet Navy's only escape route. If Russian submarines sought to break free from their frozen bases in Murmansk and enter the open Atlantic to threaten American shipping, they had to navigate through these gaps. With Greenland under American control, they could seal that door permanently. They could transform the North Atlantic into an American domain. Harry Truman made a decision that would remain classified for decades. He decided to purchase Greenland outright. He did not want a lease. He did not want temporary occupation. He wanted ownership. He wanted the American flag flying over the glaciers forever. He authorized his Secretary of State, James Byrnes, to present an offer to the Danish government. The offer was extraordinary: $100 million. In 1946, this was a tremendous fortune, equivalent to over $1.5 billion today. Truman didn't just propose paper currency. He knew Europe was devastated and currencies unstable. He offered payment in solid gold bars from Fort Knox vaults. This is the chronicle of the greatest real estate transaction that never materialized. It reveals a desperate post-war Europe, an ascending American empire, and secret negotiations that could have redrawn the world map. Had Denmark agreed, the United States would have become an Arctic superpower 50 years earlier. The Cold War would have unfolded entirely differently, and the 56,000 people living in Greenland today would be American citizens carrying U.S. passports. To comprehend why Truman believed he could simply purchase an entire country, we must examine the precedent. This wasn't America's first shopping trip to Copenhagen. In 1917, as the First World War consumed Europe, the United States feared Germany would seize Denmark's Caribbean colonies. They approached the Danes with cash. For $25 million in gold, Denmark sold the Danish West Indies to America. Overnight, these islands became the U.S. Virgin Islands. The Danish flag descended and the American flag rose. It was a clean transaction. Land for gold. Truman examined that history and thought, why not repeat this? Why not purchase the northern colony just as we bought the southern one? However, the situation in 1946 was far more complex. The man standing between Truman and his prize was a wartime figure. His name was Henrik Kauffmann. Henrik Kauffmann remains one of the most fascinating yet forgotten figures of the 20th century. He served as Danish ambassador to Washington during World War II. When Nazi forces invaded Denmark on April 9, 1940, the Danish government in Copenhagen surrendered almost instantly. They had no alternative. The German war machine proved too powerful. Yet sitting in Washington, Kauffmann refused to surrender. He declared that Copenhagen's government was acting under coercion, and therefore, he need not obey them. He proclaimed himself the independent representative of a free Denmark. He essentially became a rogue ambassador. On the anniversary of the German invasion, Kauffmann performed something extraordinary. He signed a treaty with President Franklin Roosevelt on his own authority. He granted the United States permission to construct military bases on Greenland to protect it from the Nazis. He signed the document as Henrik Kauffmann representing the king. The government in Copenhagen was furious. They charged him with high treason. They dismissed him. They demanded his return. Kauffmann ignored them. He was dubbed the King of Greenland. For 4 years, he administered the island from his Washington office. He allowed the U.S. Army to build runways, weather stations, and radar installations. Because of Kauffmann, the United States had essentially occupied Greenland for 5 years by war's end. American generals had grown comfortable there. They had invested millions in infrastructure. They had constructed the Bluey West 1 airfield in the south. They had hunted German weather teams on the ice in a secret conflict known as the Weather War. They felt a sense of ownership. Truman assumed this wartime arrangement would simply become permanent. He assumed the Danes would be grateful to surrender the burden, but he miscalculated. When the war ended, Kauffmann was vindicated. He returned to Denmark as a hero. Treason charges were dropped. He became a minister in the new government. Yet the experience had transformed the Danish relationship with Greenland. The shame of rapid surrender to Germany haunted the Danish psyche. They had lost their sovereignty once. They would not sell it again. The man tasked with executing the deal was James Byrnes. He was a smooth-talking politician from South Carolina who knew how to negotiate. He met with Danish Foreign Minister Gustav Rasmussen in New York during December of 1946. The setting was the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a symbol of American wealth and power. It was a meeting of victor and vanquished. Byrnes was confident. Rasmussen was nervous. Byrnes laid out the American position with bankers' cold logic. He argued that Greenland was a crushing financial burden to Denmark. It was a massive frozen wasteland costing millions of kroner to administer. It produced nothing except some fish and cryolite, a mineral used for aluminum production. Why should a small, broken country like Denmark burden itself with defending a continent-sized island? The United States, he argued, was the natural owner. Geographically, Greenland is part of North America. Strategically, it is vital to America. Then he revealed the figure, $100 million. Rasmussen was stunned. He knew his country was bankrupt. Nazi occupation had looted the Danish treasury. Infrastructure was crumbling. People were burning peat for heat because coal was unavailable. $100 million in gold could rebuild Copenhagen. It could construct modern hospitals, schools, and factories. It could jumpstart the Danish economy and save a generation from poverty. For a moment, the temptation must have been overwhelming. The spreadsheet logic said, sell. But nations are not businesses. They are built from history and identity. Rasmussen looked at Byrnes and saw the arrogance of a new empire. He saw a man who believed everything had a price, and he saw something else. Fear. Rasmussen understood that the biggest hesitation wasn't just pride, it was fear of the Soviet Union. Denmark was a small, flat country sitting directly at the Russian bear's doorstep. The Red Army was occupying eastern Germany just a few hundred miles from the Danish border. Soviet submarines patrolled the Baltic Sea. If Denmark sold Greenland to America, Stalin would perceive it as a hostile act. He would see Denmark officially joining the American camp. He might decide to invade Denmark as punishment or to secure the Baltic exit. Rasmussen was walking a tightrope over a pit of wolves. He had to refuse the Americans without angering them, and he had to keep the island without angering the Russians. The negotiations dragged on in secrecy. The American military kept pushing. They drafted plans for massive bases. They drew maps where Greenland was colored the same blue as the United States. They even discussed naming the new state. Would it be the state of Greenland? The territory of the North? While diplomats argued in hotels, the reality on the ground in Greenland was changing. The Cold War was freezing over. The American military wasn't waiting for a deed of sale. They were already establishing themselves. In far northern Greenland, at a place called Thule, a secret construction project began. It was codenamed Project Blue Jay. It was among the largest engineering feats in history. The U.S. Navy shipped thousands of men and millions of tons of equipment into the Arctic night. They arrived during summer when ice broke, but worked through the 24-hour darkness of winter. They built a massive air base on the permafrost. They constructed a runway 10,000 feet long capable of handling heavy B-36 Peacemaker bombers. These bombers were the stick that Truman carried. They were monsters of the sky with 6 propeller engines and 4 jet engines. They were designed to carry nuclear weapons deep into the Soviet Union. Thule was the perfect launching pad. From Thule, a bomber could reach Moscow and return without refueling. It was the dagger pointed at the Soviet Union's heart. Thule's construction was done in total secrecy. The Danish government was told very little. The local Inuit population was told nothing. In fact, a local tribe of Inughuit people who had lived on the land where the base was built for centuries became victims of a tragedy known as the Great Eviction. In May of 1953, simply to expand the anti-aircraft perimeter of the base, American commanders told the Danes that locals had to leave. Danish officials, afraid to upset their American protectors, gave the order. The Inughuit were given just a few days to pack their sleds. They were forced to abandon their homes, hunting grounds, and ancestral graves. They walked north on the ice into biting wind to a new settlement called Kvanefjeld nearly 100 miles away. They lived in tents on the ice while building new sod houses. It was a forced march that shattered the community. For decades, the Danish government denied it had been forced eviction, claiming locals had moved voluntarily. It was a lie born from desperate need to keep the Americans satisfied. So while Truman was offering money in New York, his generals were simply taking the land in Greenland. It was a de facto occupation. America knew Denmark could not stop them. What would the Danish army do? Invade Thule against the U.S. Air Force? It was impossible. But the formal sale never happened. Rasmussen eventually summoned courage to say no. He told Byrnes that honor prevented Denmark from selling part of its kingdom. He said Greenland was not a colony to be traded, but part of the Danish family. It was a polite diplomatic rejection, but firm. Truman was disappointed, but he was a pragmatist. He realized purchasing the island might actually cause more trouble than it was worth. It would appear as American imperialism. It would give the Soviets a propaganda victory. If he couldn't buy the island, he would do the next best thing. He would force Denmark to sign a defense treaty giving America everything it wanted anyway without the cost of ownership. In 1951, the Defense of Greenland Agreement was signed. It was a masterpiece of unequal negotiation. It gave the United States the right to build and maintain bases in Greenland. It gave them the right to fly over the territory. It gave them the right to station troops. It gave them legal jurisdiction over their own personnel. It was essentially a lease with no end date and no rent. Denmark kept the flag. America kept the power. This arrangement set the stage for one of the most dangerous periods in human history. The 1950s and 60s turned Greenland into the front line of nuclear standoff. The ice sheet became militarized. The skies overnight filled with white contrails of bombers carrying hydrogen bombs patrolling the edge of Soviet airspace. The strategic value of the GIUK gap became the American Navy's obsession. They developed a strategy to block the gap. They laid vast networks of underwater microphones known as SOSUS arrays on the ocean floor between Greenland and Iceland. These microphones were so sensitive they could hear a Soviet submarine starting its engines in Murmansk. Every time a Soviet sub tried to slip through the gap, the American Navy knew. They would send P-3 Orion Hunter killer planes from bases in Iceland and Greenland to track them. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the dark, freezing waters of the North Atlantic. If the Soviets could get through the gap, they could park their missile submarines off the coast of New York. If America could hold the gap, the American homeland was safe. Greenland was the anchor of this defense line. Without Greenland, the gap was wide open. But the Americans were not satisfied with just bases on the surface. They wanted to go deeper. In 1959, the U.S. Army launched one of the most bizarre and ambitious projects of the Cold War. It was called Project Iceworm. Publicly, the Army told the Danish government they were building a research station called Camp Century. They said they were testing construction techniques in the ice. They built a city under the glacier. They dug massive trenches, cut into the ice, covered them with steel arches, and buried them in snow. Inside these tunnels, they built barracks, dining halls, a movie theater, a chapel, and even a nuclear reactor to power it all. It was a marvel of engineering. But Camp Century was a lie. The real purpose of the base was to test the feasibility of Project Iceworm. The plan was to build a network of 2,500 miles of tunnels under the Greenland ice sheet. Inside these tunnels, they planned to deploy 600 nuclear missiles. These missiles would be mounted on trains constantly moving through the ice tunnels so the Soviets could never target them. It was the ultimate stealth weapon, a nuclear shotgun pointed at Russia from beneath the eternal ice. The Danish government knew nothing about the missiles. They had a strict policy of no nuclear weapons on Danish soil. America was planning to turn Greenland into the world's largest nuclear launch pad in direct violation of Danish sovereignty. Project Iceworm eventually failed, but not because of politics. It failed because of nature. The glacier moved faster than engineers predicted. The tunnels began to warp and collapse under the immense pressure of shifting ice. The nuclear reactor had to be removed. The base was abandoned in 1967, left to be crushed by the glacier. But the secret remained buried. This culture of deception came crashing down literally in 1968. On January 21st, a B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs caught fire over Baffin Bay. The crew ejected. The plane crashed onto sea ice near Thule Air Base. The conventional explosives in the bombs detonated. They did not cause nuclear explosion, but they shattered the radioactive cores of the weapons. Plutonium was scattered across the ice. It was a disaster of apocalyptic proportions. America and Denmark had to launch a massive cleanup operation codenamed Project Crested Ice. Hundreds of Danish and American workers were sent onto the frozen sea in -20-degree weather to scrape up radioactive snow. They loaded it into tanks and shipped it back to America. The accident revealed the truth. America had been using Greenland as a nuclear storage depot. The Danish public was outraged. The government in Copenhagen was humiliated. It was revealed that the Danish Prime Minister had given secret tacit approval for the flights despite the public ban. It was a scandal that shook the foundation of Danish democracy. But the strategic reality had not changed. America needed Greenland, and Denmark needed American protection. The scandal was smoothed over. The alliance held. As we end the first part of this examination, we see a world shaped by this near miss. Truman didn't get the title deed, but he got the land. The check for $100 million was rejected, but the price was paid in sovereignty, secrecy, and the displacement of the Inuit people. But the story doesn't end in the Cold War. As the ice melts and geopolitics shift, a new generation of American leaders is looking at the map again and asking the same question Truman asked. Why rent when you can buy? The modern era. The rejection of Harry Truman's $100 million check in 1946 did not end the American fascination with Greenland. It merely drove it underground. For the next 70 years, the relationship between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland was defined by a strange paradox. Denmark owned the island on paper, but the United States owned the strategic reality. The island became a phantom zone of sovereignty where Danish laws applied to people in coastal villages, but American laws applied to the vast empty spaces of the ice. This uneasy truce held through the Cold War because the enemy was clear. The Soviet Union was the threat and Greenland was the shield. But when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the calculation changed. The bombers stopped flying around the clock. The listening posts were scaled back. The SOSUS arrays were put on standby. For a brief moment, it seemed like Greenland might drift back into quiet obscurity, a place for climate scientists studying ice cores and tourists looking for the northern lights. But geography has a way of reasserting itself. As the 21st century dawned, two things happened that made Truman's old maps relevant again. First, the ice began to melt at a terrifying rate. Second, a new rival emerged in the east, China. The melting of the Arctic ice cap is the single biggest geopolitical change of our lifetime. It is opening up new shipping lanes that have been frozen since the last ice age. The northern sea route along the coast of Russia is becoming a highway for commerce, cutting travel time between Asia and Europe by 40%. Greenland sits at the intersection of these new lanes. It is the toll booth of the future Arctic economy. But more importantly, the melting ice revealed what was hidden underneath. Rare earth minerals, uranium, gold, zinc, rubies. Greenland is not just a strategic choke point anymore. It is a treasure chest, and everyone wants a key. This brings us to August 2019. Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States, revived Harry Truman's ghost. He reportedly asked his aides to look into buying Greenland. The media laughed. Late-night comedians made jokes about gold towers and Nuuk. The Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called it absurd. It was treated as a joke, a moment of reality TV diplomacy gone wrong. But if you look closely at the Trump offer, it was almost a carbon copy of the Truman offer. The logic was exactly the same. America saw a strategic asset that was vulnerable and underutilized. They saw a European power that they believed couldn't afford to maintain it, and they offered a transaction. The generals in the Pentagon were not laughing. They had briefed the president on the rare earth deposits at Kvanefjeld. They had briefed him on Chinese attempts to build airports. They knew that buying the island was a clumsy but logical solution to a massive security problem. The difference was the reaction. In 1946, the rejection was polite and diplomatic, whispered in the hushed halls of the Waldorf Astoria. In 2019, it was public and sharp, shouted across social media. The world had changed. You can no longer buy countries like you buy golf courses. The people of Greenland, who were silent in 1946, now have a voice. They have a parliament. They have a sense of nationhood. But while the purchase failed, the strategic maneuver worked. The offer was a signal flare. It woke up the Washington establishment. It forced the State Department to realize they had ignored the Arctic for too long. Suddenly, America opened a consulate in Inughuit for the first time in decades. They sent millions in aid. They started courting Greenlandic politicians. The check was rejected again, but the engagement began. The story of the GIUK gap has also returned with a vengeance. During the Cold War, the gap was about stopping Soviet submarines from attacking NATO convoys. Today, the gap is about something else. It is about the digital spine of the global economy, the Atlantic fiber optic cables. 90% of the world's internet traffic flows through undersea cables that run along the ocean floor. The cables connecting Europe and North America run right through the waters south of Greenland. Every email, every bank transfer, every military order flows through these glass threads. If a hostile power wanted to cripple the Western economy, they wouldn't need to bomb New York. They would just need to cut those cables. Russian submarines have been spotted operating near these cables with increasing frequency. They have specialized ships like the Yantar capable of deploying mini-subs to the ocean floor. The American Navy is terrified that in a conflict, Russia could sever the digital nervous system of the world, plunging the West into information darkness. So the GIUK gap is once again the most important water on Earth, and Greenland is once again the unsinkable aircraft carrier that watches over it. The American Navy has reactivated the Second Fleet specifically to guard this area. They are flying P-8 Poseidon aircraft from bases in Iceland and Greenland just like they flew P-3 Orions in the old days. The technology has changed, but the geography remains the same. But there is a new player in the gap: China. Beijing calls itself a near-Arctic state. They have no coastline in the Arctic, but they have massive ambitions. They want to build a polar Silk Road. They see Greenland as a potential logistics hub for their shipping to Europe. In 2018, a Chinese state-owned company proposed to build 3 massive international airports in Greenland. The price tag was small for China, around $500 million, but it was huge for Greenland. It would have transformed the island's economy and connected it to the world. But it would have given Beijing control over the island's air traffic. It would have given them a foothold in the GIUK gap. The reaction in Washington was panic. The idea of Chinese jets operating from Greenland was a red line. America put massive pressure on Denmark. They told Copenhagen they cannot let this happen. Denmark, which usually tries to stay out of Greenland's internal affairs, had to step in. They used their veto power over national security issues to block the Chinese deal. Then, to smooth things over, the Danish government offered to finance the airports themselves. It was a classic example of checkbook diplomacy. America didn't pay for the airports directly, but they forced their ally to pay to keep the rival out. It was the Truman Doctrine updated for the 21st century. Containment. The people of Greenland are watching this game with weary eyes. They know they are the prize, but they are tired of being treated as a chessboard. In 1953, the Inughuit were evicted from Thule to make way for bombers. They were given 4 days to leave their ancestral hunting grounds. They walked north on the ice carrying their children and their tents. It took decades for them to receive an apology or compensation. That memory is still fresh. Today, Greenlanders want independence. They are self-governing, but they still rely on a block grant from Denmark to pay for their schools and hospitals. It covers about half of their public budget. They know that to be truly free, they need money. And the only way to get money is to sell their resources or their strategic location. This creates a dilemma. Do they sell rights to Chinese mining companies and risk angering America? Do they accept American military expansion and risk becoming a target in a war? Or do they stay with Denmark and remain a semi-colony forever? In the 2021 elections in Greenland, this dilemma came to a head. The election was fought over a massive mining project at Kvanefjeld. The site contains the world's largest deposit of rare earth minerals essential for electric cars and fighter jets, but it also contains uranium. The pro-mining party wanted to dig. The anti-mining party wanted to protect the environment. The anti-mining party won, effectively blocking the mine for now. But the pressure is not going away. America needs those minerals to break China's monopoly on the tech supply chain. The Pentagon is investing directly in other mining projects in Greenland that don't involve uranium. They are trying to build a supply chain that bypasses China entirely using Greenlandic rocks. The irony of the $100 million offer is that Greenland is worth infinitely more than that today. The rare earth deposits at Kvanefjeld alone are worth billions. The strategic value of the Thule radar, which tracks satellites and missiles, is priceless. If Truman had bought it in 1946, it would have been the greatest return on investment in history. It would have made the Louisiana Purchase look like a bad deal. It would have secured American dominance for a century. But because the sale never happened, we are left with a complex web of alliances. The Kingdom of Denmark is a strange construct. It is a small European nation holding onto a massive Arctic territory that is slowly drifting toward North America both geologically and politically. The American military is digging in for the long haul. They are upgrading the radar at Thule. They are surveying the deep waters of the fjords for submarine hiding spots. They are preparing for a future where the Arctic Ocean is navigable year-round. The Air Force is conducting exercises to see if they can land F-35 fighters on frozen lakes. The Marines are training in cold weather warfare again. If you go to GIUK today, you will see the changes. You will see American diplomats hosting receptions. You will see construction cranes building new apartments funded by Danish pension funds, terrified of Chinese investment. You will see mining prospectors from Australia and Canada drinking beer in hotels, talking about yields and drilling samples. The sleepy colonial outpost is waking up. The rejected Czech of 1946 is a ghost that haunts every meeting. It reminds everyone that sovereignty is fragile. It reminds the Danes that their hold on the island is based on history, not geography. It reminds the Americans that money cannot buy everything. And it reminds Greenlanders that they are sitting on the most valuable rock in the world. The Cold War never really ended in Greenland. It just went into hibernation under the ice. And now, as the ice melts, the old conflicts are thawing out. The GIUK gap is active. The bombers are watching. And the checkbook is still on the table, waiting for a signature. The map on Harry Truman's wall in 1946 is the same map that hangs in the Situation Room today. The colors may have faded, but the reality is starker than ever. Whoever holds Greenland holds the world, and the United States has no intention of letting go, even if they don't own the deed. The story of the $100 million offer is not a story of failure. It is a story of ambition. It showed the scale of American thinking. It showed a willingness to redraw the world to suit American security. And that ambition has not disappeared. It has just changed shape. Instead of gold bars, it is now defense treaties and consulate openings and rare earth investments and airport financing. The heist didn't happen in 1946, but in the slow-motion way of empires, the takeover is happening every day. The United States is buying Greenland inch by inch, influence by influence, contract by contract. And one day, we may look back and realize that the sale went through after all, just without the check. The flag flying over the ice may still be red and white, but the power that moves beneath it is red, white, and blue.